So today we are playing with the best deck in Legacy, straight up. I wrote an article about this deck a couple weeks ago, and most of the pertinent information was in there, so if you want to check that out, that might be helpful. But this deck has been tuned for what I perceive to be the real-life metagame, and Moto's a little weird, so hopefully we don't get crushed and I just get embarrassed, but during the invitational weekend, myself, Todd Anderson, and James Wynn had a phenomenal record with this deck. And it's very rare for that to happen, just because, you know, Legacy is this format where everyone is playing like all these powerful things, and for someone to get like an 82% win rate, that's just like absurd to me, and that was basically how we did. So, the things that set this deck apart from other Legacy decks are basically the lack of win conditions, the fact that you attack on multiple different angles, and the fact that you're probably one of the best dig through time decks, if not the best dig through time deck, plus the access to Pyroblast. So the reason why being low on win conditions is valuable is because if you're playing a Delver mirror match and you have Delvers on the draw, like they're so much less effectual in those matchups, just because like the games are all about tempo, and just by starting on the draw, it just means that cards like Delver are going to be so much worse. You know, like you might have to spend your early turns reacting to what your opponent's doing. Meanwhile, you have these like Delvers and things in your hand that you don't really have a chance to actually play out. So this deck is not really interested in necessarily being on the play or the draw. Like certainly it matters a decent amount, you know, because of things like days and whatnot, but ultimately you don't really care that much because you're just trying to play catch up anyway. And while being on the draw makes that a little more difficult, it's not like, oh, well, if I'm on the draw, I'm suddenly, you know, trying to play this tempo game against someone where they just automatically have this huge advantage, and several of my cards are dead as a result of that. So this deck is basically built with that type of stuff in mind, and being on the draw is really not that bad. You know, I mean, the deck has no basic lands, so things like Wasteland are certainly an issue. Stifle is also an issue, but that card is not very heavily played right now, which is very, very good. But yeah, for the most part, it is basically that. It just comes down to the Delver thing. Like, this deck will kill you incidentally. It's going to basically grind you down to nothing with Cabal Therapy and have Force of Will in case you top deck something crazy. Plus, it has answers to most things, you know, like there are Pyroblast to answer Jace the Mind Sculptor and so on. So, basically, it's really tough to just like pin this deck down because it's not really weak to a certain type of thing. Certainly, Graveyard Hate is kind of an issue because you're kind of relying on Dig Through Time, and to a lesser extent, like the Snapcaster Mage and the Flashback on Cabal Therapies. But you know, even with that, there are still things like Young Pyromancer that just don't care about the things like Leyline or Rest in Peace or whatever. Plus, a lot of the decks that have things like Rest in Peace also want to use their graveyard themselves. So they have to sideboard out some Dig Through Times or Snapcaster Mages of their own, you know, if we're talking about Miracles or whatever. So this deck is just overall very well-rounded and is capable of playing the full control game, which most decks in Legacy are not capable of doing. I would say that most of the time, like when you're building a Legacy deck, you can build it a little bit slower and a little more controlling, but for the most part, you have to be able to turn that corner quickly. And while this deck can do that, it doesn't necessarily have to do that because of the fact that you have Cabal Therapy and Counterspells. So if you're just relying on Counterspells, you know, like maybe there are things like Daze or Spell Pierce or Spell Snare that kind of go dead and aren't necessarily good against everything, but this deck can actually just grind you into the dust. And it can actually take full control of a game, which not a lot of other decks can do. So we have 12 cantrips. Brainstorm Ponder, obviously, the best ones you could play. You could make an argument for Thought Scour also with Dig Through Time, but I found with Thought Scour, I was not necessarily finding the cards that I needed as quickly as I wanted them. So, you know, Thought Scour is just a random card, whereas something like Ponder, it gives you a decent amount of selection. Like looking at 3 cards, potentially 4 if you actually shuffle, and the selection with the fetch lands, you know, where you can like kind of just cherry pick the top card, shuffle away the rest, is very, very powerful, and certainly not to be understated because it's one of the reasons why the deck exists. Thought Scour just did not give me that type of action, and while it fueled my Dig Through Times faster, it kind of meant that like in the early game, I didn't have the stuff I needed, so I kind of need to cast Dig Through Time to find answers instead of just like having them already, courtesy of my Ponder. And since you are trying to cast like Ponder and Brainstorm to fix your hand and look for answers to the things that your opponent's doing, you don't actually want to cast Dig Through Time on like turn 3. If it comes up, cool, but most of the time you want Dig Through Time to be like the last card you cast out of your hand. And then that can either find like a Pyromancer or a Brainstorm, you know, something to fix your hand up, or a clock. Maybe it's a Force of Will and a blue card, so that you turn your Dig Through Time basically into a counter spell, which is also fine. But yeah, I mean, Ponder is so much better than Thought Scour, and I might be like the world's biggest Thought Scour fan, and the fact that I'm playing 0 should be very telling. The other cantrip is Gitaxian Probe, and geez, this card. Even if we weren't playing with Young Pyromancer and Cabal Therapy, you know, like, it certainly helps with both of those cards for different reasons. You know, you get to play Pyromancer, play a Probe, maybe 2, find out what they're working with, and a lot of the times I just let my Pyromancer die. I'm not willing to fight over this necessarily, unless for whatever reason I think I need the clock in play, or I think that they're going to die within 2 turns, just because, again, this deck is a full control deck. You don't want to fight over these cards that your deck kind of blanks in the first place. So things like Swords to Plowshares, Terminus, whatever, I usually just let them go. Like, I'll be able to, you know, kill them somewhere down the line or find another clock. Like, it's really not that big of a deal. I mostly want to fight over the things that actually matter, and things like Swords to Plowshares ultimately don't matter. So, yeah, Gitaxian Probe with Young Pyromancer is very nice because you get to play Pyromancer, potentially expose it to a removal spell, but still get a little value out of it. So either you end up with a blocker, something you can sack to Cabal Therapy later, or even just a clock. And I've killed people with 2 elemental tokens several times, so that is certainly a pretty big selling point for Gitaxian Probe. But the other one is Cabal Therapy, and Therapy is not an easy card to play with. This might be one of the most skill testing cards of all time, if not the most skill testing, just because you have to kind of like replay the game and try and figure out what is, you know, likely for your opponent to have, or at least be able to cross off options, you know, like figure out things that they don't have. Because it's not just about like, oh, I have to Therapy the card that I'm really scared of, because ultimately that's not necessarily what matters, because the card that you're most scared of, they probably just don't have it, you know, depending on how the game played out, right? Like, if there would have been a great spot for them to cast that card, almost certainly they don't have it. But also, it's just like, you get to mess up their Brainstorms. Like, a lot of people might play like a Ponder on turn 1, and then you get to Therapy them for Brainstorm, and then, like, you know, they might even have like 2 Brainstorms, just because like that's not a card that you want to fire off on the first turn. You know, it just like doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, the Brainstorms get better the longer the game goes on. I've also had spots where I Therapy them, maybe I Probe Therapy them, I know that they have a Brainstorm, and they also have a 2-of in their hand, and then I'll Therapy them, they'll try and Brainstorm in response to hide their cards, and I'll just like Force of Will or Pyroblast that, or Counterspell, I guess, and use Therapy to pick apart their hand. So then, like, I end up Force of Willing a Brainstorm, which is something I wouldn't necessarily do, but it just means that my Cabal Therapy is so much more better. So, the blind therapies are going to be tough. I think my hit rate is pretty good. It's probably like 70 to 75%, somewhere in there. And some of those times are like, well, this is literally the only thing I lose to, so I might as well name it, even if it's not likely that they have it, because like none of the other stuff that they could possibly have matters. But there's definitely a fine line between that and every other situation ever, where it's like, all right, if they have a counterbalance to go with their top or whatever, I'll just lose, so I'm going to name that, even though if they had it, they probably would have played it. You know, like that type of situation doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. In that spot, I'll probably try and figure out a card that they could have. Maybe it's a Snapcaster Mage, maybe it's a Dig Through Time, maybe it's a Pyroblast, something along those lines. And basically, you want to trade 1-for-1 as much as possible, unless, like I said, there are those spots where it is the only card that you lose to and nothing else matters. So, Therapy is not easy. It is very difficult. Blind Therapy in combo decks is also a lot of fun and very difficult, so hopefully that'll come up some. For Lightning Bolt, should be kind of self-explanatory. At this point, the format is all about, well, not all about, but most of the good threats are very cheap and die to Lightning Bolt. So Tarmogoyf is not really lining up well against like Young Pyromancer, Gurmag Angler, Baleful Strix, things like that. So people are playing less Tarmogoyfs, they're playing more Young Pyromancers, more Deathrights, more Delver of Secrets and whatnot. So Bolt just ends up being phenomenal. Plus there are things like Goblin Guide and Jace the Mind Sculptor and like all these things that you just want a Lightning Bolt. So Bolt is probably the best card, and I'm very happy playing 4 of that card. The Innocent Bloods, though, probably require some explanation. Basically, this card is bad, somewhat bad with Baleful Strix, but is actually pretty good for pretty good with Young Pyromancer for what it is. So you get to play Innocent Blood, make a token, and then just sack that token. So it's basically just like B, Sorcery, Edict them, which is very nice. And Innocent Blood deals with a lot of the problematic cards, like Gurmag Angler, Tarmogoyf, things that might be too big, or True Name Nemesis, things you can't really target down. Could also beat like an Emrakul, potentially a Griselbrand, although Innocent Blooding a Griselbrand is probably not the best way for you to win games, but there are very few things that actually make Innocent Blood bad. You know, there's some Lingering Souls, some Young Pyromancers out there, whatever, maybe some Baleful Strixes, but most of the time Innocent Blood is going to be very, very good. So yeah, I started with 1, went up to a 2nd copy. I cut the Toxic Deluge. Not that it didn't make any sense. Some people are like, oh, that's really bad in your Young Pyromancer deck. And it's like, yeah, kind of, but not really. You know, like if you have a Pyromancer against like a True Name Nemesis, you can generally attack around them as long as you're not starting out that race when you're at so low of a life total. But with Dig Through Time, it is nice to have a powerful effect that you might want access to as the game goes long, and this deck is certainly intending on the games going long, so having a thing like a Sweeper in your main deck is actually very powerful, but ultimately I decided I didn't actually need it. It was easy enough to just deal with my opponent's board by 1-for-1ing them, or kind of locking up the ground with Young Pyromancer, so I did want a 2nd Innocent Blood, and that came from the Toxic Deluge slot. If you feel like there's a lot of elves, maybe Death and Taxes and stuff, then maybe you want the Sweeper still, but I haven't really needed it. I do have it hanging out in the sideboard, but that's, you know, that's kind of like my Perish, Toxic Deluge, split card sort of thing, you know, Massacre, I guess, too. But yeah, Innocent Blood has been very, very good. Nimble Mongoose is another thing that this kills, so. Other than that, we have some 1-ofs, we have a Jace, we have a Kolaghan's Command, a Counterspell, and a Snapcaster. And basically, what this deck wants to do is deal with your opponent's stuff, cast a Dig Through Time. At that point, you're up a card on them, and you try and fade the stuff that kills you. So, the scariest stuff are generally the things that you can't deal with just a removal spell. So, Counterbalance, or maybe like an Infernal Tutor for Passive Flames when they already have a bunch of mana or whatever. You can't kill those things with removal, necessarily. So, you need some amount of hard counter magic to lock the game up, and while Force of Will is good, it is certainly very taxing. You know, you don't necessarily have a bunch of blue cards lying around. You generally want to cast your cantrips as soon as you can. So having a hard counter spell and a Snapcaster Mage to potentially flashback that counter spell is very nice. Also, Kolaghan's Command can lock out their draw step, which is very, very nice. If they are hellbent, thanks to Cabal Therapy or what have you, you can command them in their draw step, make them discard a card. Maybe rebuy the Snapcaster or Young Pyromancer, get a little clock going. Command is also a main deck answer to Equipment, which is very, very nice. And again, this is a card that I could see maybe having 2 of, but since the games do go long, and generally the times when you want Kolaghan's Command are the later times in the game, I think just having 1 with the digs is fine. And if this gets countered or whatever, you use it early. For whatever reason, you can always Snapcaster it back. So it feels like this deck has just like a bunch of 1-ofs. But because of Snapcaster, because of Kolaghan's Command, and the presence of Dig Through Time to find those cards, you actually get multiple uses out of a lot of these cards. So the deck is pretty streamlined at this point. We do have a main deck Pyroblast also, which kind of fills the counterspell role, but is also a removal spell for Delver of Secrets. So the metagame is very blue heavy. I can't say the same for Magic Online necessarily, because the tournaments are generally pretty small, and you know, who knows what people are going to show up with, basically. So the main deck Pyroblast might end up being pretty bad. You could play as many as 2 Pyroblasts if you're playing in real life, and I think that's perfectly defensible, but I only have 1. I don't think it's something you necessarily need. And then there's the Daze, which is also kind of a weirdo card, but kind of what I was talking about earlier with the Probe with the Young Pyromancer. Just like, you can play Young Pyromancer and then have a bunch of 1-drops and it's really good, but ultimately you want 0 mana spells. Like, when you have Pyromancer going and you're kind of just crushing them with that, you just want a bunch of 0s, or like even if the game is close and you're kind of behind and you need a bunch of elementals, you really want some zeros. So even if Probe costs you 2 life, or Daze costs you a land drop, or Force of Will costs you a life in a card, you know, even Therapy Flashback is very nice. It is very much worth it, and Daze is just one of those cards that might not make a lot of sense because we are trying to play this late game, so, you know, Daze goes dead pretty quickly, especially since there's not a lot of mana denial in this deck. You know, people are going to be able to make their land drops and whatnot, but Daze is this card that is so good in the early game, plus, even on, like, turn 4 or something, they might not play around it just because a deck like this shouldn't have Daze in it, you know, it just, like, doesn't make a lot of sense. But I do think having a 0 mana card in the deck is very, very powerful, so I don't mind the 1 Daze, and it's a card that generally gets sided out in matchups where they become more attrition-based post-board, because the game's go on longer, the Daze just accumulate in your hand, they're not very good. Sometimes you have to spend like 2 Dazes to counter 1 spell, and that's not very good, but in matchups like Miracles, if they're jamming like Monastery Mentors and stuff, and if they're just like jamming Jace the Mind Sculptor whenever you're tapped out, I don't mind actually just keeping the Daze in. It all depends on how my opponent is playing, though. But Daze is also kind of like another Force of Will against combo, which is certainly very nice, because I don't like losing to combo decks. The other 2 weird things in the deck are the Baleful Strixes, which are basically just Annihilate against Tarmogoyf and Delver. You just play it, draw a card, sit on it, and then they either have to make this terrible trade that they don't want to, or they have to find some way to deal with Baleful Strix, which is also fine because you're already up a card. So Strix is very nice in that regard. And then the other thing is the 1 Wasteland. Why the hell am I playing a Wasteland? Well, I play 2 Wastelands in Shardless, and I like having the ability to kill utility lands. There are things out there like Glacial Chasm and Rashadan Port and Creeping Tar Pit and stuff where it's like, you know, sometimes you just want a clean answer to deal with stuff like that. And like I said with these dig through times earlier, I mean, the games go long, you find your spicy one-ofs, and I don't mind it. I don't mind having the Wasteland just to answer stuff like that. I've used it on some mana-screwed opponents. I've used it against Miracles to take out the red mana so they can't cast Pyroblast. And it's just a 19th land in a deck that would otherwise only play 18 land, which I'm fine with. And then the other weird thing is my fetch lands. I just got rid of my Scalding Tarns because they were pretty expensive. And all of these lands still do the same job. I only have Seas and Volks in the deck, so it doesn't really matter as long as they fetch blue, black, or red, some combination of those. And all of those lands accomplish what I'm trying to do. So it might tip my opponent off that I don't have any basics, but ultimately, if they see me fetch a bunch of dual lands, they're going to prioritize things like Price of Progress and Blood Moon anyway, so it's not that big of a loss, I don't think. But for the sideboard, it's kind of weird, I guess. I have some Graveyard Hate and Nile Spellbombs. Some people play Rakdos Charm, Surgical Extraction, Ley Line of the Void. I like Nile Spellbomb the best out of those, I think, just because there are decks like Miracles that I would happily board in Spellbomb against, but something like Surgical, Rakdos Charm, or Leyline are, you know, they're a thing that like fight their graveyard but put me down a card, and I don't necessarily want that. I would rather just have a Spellbomb sitting in play to counter a Snapcaster, or just like use it at some point when I think they're going to set up a dig through time. And I used to have Null Rod instead of these Pithing Needles, but Null Rod was super awkward with Nile Spellbomb, so I had to fix that. So I have 2 Needles, and the main answer for these are Aether Vial and Sensei's Divining Top, which Null Rod conveniently takes care of as well. Null Rod is also very good against Storm because it stops their Lotus Petals and Lion's Eye Diamonds. But I think I'm good enough against Storm to where I don't need Null Rod in my sideboard. If there wasn't the tension between Null Rod and Nile Spellbomb, I would certainly have Null Rod, I think. But Pithing Needle is also a card that's good against lands. So again, this is a thing that might not be super relevant for Magic Online because I've played against like more mud decks and, you know, just random paintery artifact things that Null Rod is just great against, whereas, you know, Needle is just kind of medium against them. But for real life, I don't mind having the Pithing Needles, especially if you're playing in the Northeast where lands is incredibly popular. Also have Saba's Web. This is good against Death and Taxes, also good against lands. Any sort of, you know, weirdo kind of land-based deck. You know, some of the mud decks fall under that if they have like Factory Port Wasteland. You know, you might want Web against them. The Deluge for a sweeper. Therapy is the 4th discard spell. James talked me into playing 2 Thoughtseize in this spot just because they're kind of like more probes, so it's less likely that you miss off any future therapies if you get to look at their hand first. But my response to that was kind of just get better at casting Cabal Therapy. I'm not sure if that's like a reasonable excuse or not, but I could see either the 4 Therapy or a couple Thoughtseizes in the sideboard, whatever floats your boat. Another Kolaghan's Command. I like being able to kill Batterskull. I hate Stoneforge Mystic decks with a passion. Absolutely despise losing to them. Rakdos Charm is another card that, you know, can be good against graveyards and be good against artifacts, but I think Kolaghan's Command is just more versatile. You probably bring it in more spots. Staticaster is kind of like another Toxic Deluge type of thing. And at this point, you guys should be seeing a theme where it's like, I got a few things that are good against artifacts, you know, some needles, whatever. I got a few things that are good against little creatures. I have Sulfur Elemental. Is it Staticaster, Toxic Deluge, depending on what kind of deck you're playing against. And that's basically it. I want to have multiple cards to bring in against a bunch of different decks, but I don't want my sideboard to be like 4 Red Blast, 4 Blue Blast, 4 Leyline, etc. So, you know, say I play against Death and Taxes, I'll bring in like the Command, the Web, probably the Staticaster, the Deluge, a couple Sulfur Elementals, a couple Pithing Needles, and then boom, 8 cards against D&T, and that's without playing like 4 Dread of Knights or whatever. So this is kind of how I like to build my Legacy sideboards if I can. But the big selling point to me for these Sulfur Elementals is not that like the D&T matchup is that bad, but Sulfur Elemental gives you a thing that you can bring in against Miracles, which is a solid threat on its own. You know, maybe they play Jace and they're like, Brainstorm, whatever, this guy sided out his Lightning Bolts, haha, and then you like flash in a Sulfur Elemental and kill their Jace. But it's also this thing that is very, very good against Monastery Mentor, and you don't necessarily know if everyone has Monastery Mentor. So Sulfur Elemental is this thing that kind of allows you to hedge against them. You're like, oh, I don't know how many bolts I want to keep in and stuff like that. And in this point, like, you have Sulfur Elementals, you get to bring that in just happily because it's a solid threat on its own. You know, they have to plow it or whatever. And you have this thing that can potentially shut off their Monastery Mentors, which is very, very nice. So, also, obviously very good against Death and Taxes, but Miracles is kind of the big selling point for this card. And then I have 2 Red Elemental Blasts to go along with my Pyroblast. These are not Pyroblasts, even though they're slightly better with Young Pyromancer. So with Pyromancer, it is just like whenever you cast a thing, and Pyroblast is you can just cast this targeting anything, and it's destroy target permanent if it's blue, whereas Red Elemental Blast has to target a blue permanent. It's destroy target blue permanent. So Pyroblast, you can just be like, Pyroblast your land, nothing happens, but I make a 1/1 off my Young Pyromancer. With Red Elemental Blast, you can't do that. So there is the theory that Pyroblast is strictly worse, or Pyroblast is strictly better than Red Elemental Blast because you can cast it whenever you want to get a Young Pyromancer token. And that is kind of true, but that also just basically never comes up. Like, if there's a matchup that you're playing where Pyroblast is good, and you have Pyromancer in play, and you're like, oh man, I'm 1 point short, but if only I could cast this Red Elemental Blast to get an extra token, I would kill him. That's just never going to come up because then you still have a Pyroblast in your hand. So you can generally stop, you know, whatever they're going to use. If it's like a Brainstorm to dig for answers or a Jace or whatever, you know, maybe they just like Miracle Terminus and kill all your guys, and it's like, well, that sucks, but hey, at least I still have this Pyroblast, you know, like, if it comes down to like us being in a top deck war, I still have this Pyroblast, I'm still up a card on you, and it's a very, very good card, I'm still probably going to win. So the reason I diversify is because this deck might actually become more popular, and I don't want Therapy always naming Pyroblast to hit. So Pyroblast, since it is in the main deck, there might be matchups where you just want to cast this to make a token or to get a card in your graveyard for dig through time, and you just can't. So people are just going to assume that Pyroblast is the card that you just play. Like, if you're going to side in more blasts, they should just be more Pyroblast, right? But that's kind of incorrect. So I think most of the time, if they're going to Therapy me and they think I have like a Pyroblast effect, they're just going to name Pyroblast, and they're going to be very sad if I have a Red Elemental Blast. So very small, minor thing, but also worth talking about. And then a couple Blue Blasts, and what sold me on the first Blue Blast is that I bring it in against other red-blue decks because they have Pyroblasts. And Red Elemental Blast is one of the cleanest answers to a Pyroblast. This dates back to Extended in the early 2000s, where this was the thing. You know, your opponent would have 3 or 4 Pyroblasts, you bring in a Hydro Blast or 2, and you have clean answers to them. So Blue Blast is very nice for that. I have the second one because it's hella good against Burn, and some other random stuff out there. You know, if you need to beat up on a Painter deck or kill a Blood Moon or whatever, like Reb or Beb, I guess, is there for you. So the second one doesn't necessarily have to be there. I definitely like the first one because I bring it in against Miracles and like the Mirror and stuff, but the second one is perfectly reasonable, at least for real life. So that's it. That's my novel about this deck. Pretty absurd that I talked for over 10 minutes. about this deck when I already wrote an article about all this stuff. But there it is. Best deck in Legacy, according to me. So let's see how it does.